Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 79, Lend-Lease Revisited, with Angus Wallace. Welcome to Episode 79 of Beyond Barbarossa, the first English language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, also called Ottawa, Canada, a country that remains free, independent, and sovereign, no matter what certain orange clowns may say. This is the last episode of Season 3 of Beyond Barbarossa, and it's a very special one. I'm joined by fellow podcaster Angus Wallace of the World War II podcast. Angus is here to discuss the Lend-Lease program, where the Western Allies, principally the United States, but also Canada and to a smaller extent the UK, provided supplies to the UK. It was a recipient and a donor, and mostly the USSR. Another version of this conversation will appear soon on Angus's World War II podcast, so look out for that. You'll find a link in the show notes and on the webpage for this episode. Angus is here to discuss the Lend-Lease program. This podcast, Beyond Barbarossa, discussed it in detail in episode 32 at the beginning of season 2. If you'd like to refresh your memory of the details, feel free to review it after you finish listening to this one. So now, let's bring in our guest, Angus Wallace. I'm very happy to be joined by Angus. Welcome, Angus, to Beyond Barbarossa.
Thank you, Scott.
So I'm just going to do a quick recap of how Lend-Lease came about starting in 1941. Actually, in the 1930s, there was a strong isolationist trend in the United States politics. And in fact, the Neutrality Acts in 1935, 1936, and 1937 were intended to keep the U.S. out of foreign wars. And the laws made it illegal for any American to sell or transport arms or other war material to any nation at war, whether it was a defender or an attacker. Now, the last Neutrality Act lapsed in 1939, and President Franklin Roosevelt was interested in getting involved in the looming war in Europe. He proposed a replacement to the Neutrality Act that would give him more flexibility in dealing with an aggressive Germany, Japan, and Italy. Now, that bill was initially defeated until Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. And the Congress turned around and passed the Pittman Act. It led to what was called a cash and carry program, so-called. So it allowed Britain and France to buy and export or bring in U.S. arms, but they had to pay in cash. No credit, no loans of any kind. And they had to transport the weapons and other material on their own ships. So it was great for the U.S. manufacturing economy, not so great for Britain and France at the time. Of course, Germany defeated France in 1940, at which point Britain asked for more help from the Americans. There's a quote from Churchill listing all the things they wanted, basically a lot of ships and other things, and then talked about coming to the question of finance. Oh, so British in the way he asked for a lot of great stuff for free.
Yeah.
Didn't want to pay for it or couldn't pay for it. Oh, actually, I think they could have paid for it.
Well, I think they probably could have, but he was always playing the long game.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. They asked for 3 million tons of merchant shipping to bring in all these supplies from the world, from not only the US, but also from the far-flung world-spanning British Empire. And they also wanted Navy warships. So that brings us up to 1941. 1941, of course, Germany invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. And immediately the allies, Western allies, Britain and the US, decided that they would support the Soviet Union. They had a common enemy. Ooh, that's hard to say. Okay, so they started delivering aid, including war material, ammunition, but very importantly, food, because part of the need for the USSR was food. The rapid invasion had taken away a lot of Soviet, so Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian food production. The Germans had quickly conquered most of Ukraine, especially the agricultural production area of Ukraine. And also the Soviet scorched earth policy that Stalin had ordered had destroyed more agricultural production. The long and short of it is, by the end of 1941, Soviet food production is way down. So they were, for a time at any rate, really dependent on imports of food. So that's where we are in early 1942. Of course, what else was going on was Stalin, as we heard 2 episodes ago, Stalin ordered all the factories west of Moscow to be disassembled, put on trains, and shipped farther east beyond the range of German bombers, and then reassembled and go into production. But of course, that takes time to break down a factory and especially to put it back together and get it running again. Also, they needed the raw materials. By the time the Germans had taken the Donetsk Basin or the Donbass, a lot of their source, not all of it, but a lot of the sources of raw materials, coal, steel, and so on, were gone or not available to the Soviets. So they had to shift production sources or raw material sources. Again, all that takes time. The delivery of Lend-Lease becomes critical in the USSR.
And that's perhaps where we can think about nuancing how critical it is.
Okay, and Angus has some thoughts on the nuances and on just how critical to the USSR the Lend-Lease program was. So what are your thoughts on this, Angus?
Well, I wonder if it's perhaps an interesting point to start with. If we take the look from the historical point of view, it's worth pointing out from the Russian point of view, they've always played down the importance of Lend-Lease because they're taking an ideological stance. So throughout the Cold War, the Russians say, well, we didn't need Lend-Lease. That Lend-Lease didn't really do much for the war effort, because to admit that Lend-Lease was important downplays the efforts of the Soviet people and would heighten the reputation of the US in the Cold War, which obviously Cold War Russia didn't want to do. They always argued throughout the Cold War that the deliveries were insignificant, which they weren't. There was a tremendous amount of stuff. Let's just call it stuff. There was a big mixed bag of stuff arrived in enormous quantities. They argued that the Allied kit was poor. Perhaps they got the Aircobra and the King Cobra from the US, which were good planes, but they're not the planes that the US were necessarily flying in great numbers, were they? But they were.
No, they weren't.
But that's not to say they were bad planes, but they had the planes. So there is a potential, and some of those British tanks were not necessarily as good as the T-34. Certainly, you look at the Shermans that arrive in numbers. So their kit was poor, and there might be some merit to that. And they're even down to the amount of kit that arrived for Lend-Lease has been disputed. The Russians played it down, and in the 50s, they refused to pay anymore because they said they'd paid enough. So there's a lot to be said for how it's always worth thinking about when you think about Lend-Lease of the prism that we're viewing through, because obviously the Americans in reverse like to build it up through the Cold War to say no. It was Lend-Lease that saved the Soviet Union. And I think both arguments are partially true.
Okay, I'm just going to point out this is something that I did cite in episode 32. This is a quote from Nikita Khrushchev after the war. He said this after the death of Stalin. He recollects Stalin speaking to him. And this is the quote. Stalin stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could have not have stood up against Germany's pressure and we would have lost the war. But Khrushchev telling people what he remembered Stalin saying.
We can nuance that further. If Russia stood up to Germany one-to-one, but Russia was never standing up to Germany one-to-one, because even if it didn't get Lend-Lease, Germany was still fighting the Allies in North Africa. Right. Those vital German air resources were being shuffled from North Africa to the Eastern Front and North Africa. They're fighting in the Atlantic. So Russia was never alone. The question comes down to how important or how useful Lend-Lease was. And so if we think about, we've got to 1940, that winter of 1941 with the Germans at the gates of Moscow.
Right.
Well, the Lend-Lease is only agreed in that winter or the autumn of 41. Lend-Lease comes in March 41. It's only for the British. The Americans.
Right.
So at this point, the Americans aren't even at war. It's a way for the Americans to stay out of the war and keep the British fighting. Is a sort of a fast and loose way of putting it. Then Russia is drawn into the war with the German invasion. So they then decide on a Soviet first principle with the British, the Americans, FDR and the British, to send kit to Russia. So it's perhaps, you mentioned counterfactuals. One of our counterfactuals could easily be, how crucial was Lend-Lease in that winter of 41, 42, keeping Germany from Moscow? They're on the back foot, but the Germany is at the limit of its logistical support. It's now facing a winter it wasn't expecting to be fighting in, on a Russia that's fallen back on its capital city, and they're throwing everything at it. I might argue that Lend-Lease wasn't that critical from a material point of view at that moment in time, because they've got to get the stuff. And this point, this will come up a few times, but it's how do we get stuff to Russia? So at this point, we're bringing things through the Arctic convoys.
Right. That was the first convoys went north of Norway, which was under German control, and quite a dangerous route. Although I believe that the first convoy made it through without any losses. It went to Archangel, which was not an ice-free port year-round.
Yeah.
That's why in the First World War, the the Russians built Murmansk, which would be ice-free more of the year, I think all year round, because of the ocean currents. That first convoy didn't bring, and it was a significant amount. I think that had the first hurricane fighters in crates. And Stalin's reaction was, "Oh, that's very nice, but couldn't you have sent Spitfires?"
It comes back down to, we're sending stuff, but we're not necessarily sending what we need, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. And so there's an interesting sort of parallel there to later, or correlation, I guess, or just makes me remember that in 1944, when the Soviets were already pushing the Germans back out of most of, at least, Russian territory and out of Ukraine, the Germans sent a bunch of anti-tank weapons to Finland as the Soviets launched their last campaign in the continuation war. And that was anti-tank guns that Germany really could have used themselves.
Yeah.
You mentioned the idea, which lens we're looking at this Lend-Lease program from. Maybe in 1941, 42, there wasn't that much material coming in yet. All the routes hadn't been worked out. But from a psychological point of view, from a morale point of view, for the Soviet people to see, oh, America is helping us. So maybe we have a chance here.
Yeah.
We've been devastated. We've lost so much of our production capacity, so much of our food capacity, but we've got something coming in from elsewhere, from around the world.
Whilst the material coming in is not necessarily battle winning in significant numbers, visually seeing something from another country is proof to people at Moscow that actually we have help from elsewhere. More will come. So Lend-Lease in that winter is not necessarily crucial, but the Russians do, I would argue, all they had to do was not lose. And from the point of not losing, that at that point they'd won, because all they had to do then was not lose. Right. And actually, as everything slowly starts to ramp up, not losing allows them to turn the tide. And it's that at that moment in time, it's not crucial to the defense of Moscow, but there's a psychological boost to the Russian people to see foreign aid coming in 1941. I mean, less than $1 million of aid arrived in 1941. So it's not that much. It's just symbolic.
Right. Although $1 million went a lot further in 1941.
Well, it did, yeah. But it's because the other thing is, what do you ship? I mean, people are still trying to work out what do you ship. All right, you send a few Hurricanes, but if you've only got a handful of Hurricanes, it's only going to so much use, because you have the spares, you have the men to use them. Russians didn't want technicians exploring technicians on their soil, so the Russians had to figure out how to use them. Okay, we've got Pericles, but how long did it take the Russians to figure out how they worked, how to repair them, how to build them? Because they're in crates, you have to put them together. So it would be months before those really started to see operational use. And the first time the Allies sent the Russians anything, they didn't just throw them into battle. They actually tested them, figured them out, and then put them in. So there's always a delay as soon as anything new arrives before the Soviet forces got them.
That's right. And there's another time factor, a very important one. But before we explore that, let's take a short break. Listeners, we'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by the Eastern Front Trilogy, the true story of a Canadian man, Maurice Bury, drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941, just in time to be thrown between the jaws of the USSR and Nazi Germany at the launch of the greatest land invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. It comes in 3 volumes, Army of War and Souls, Under the Nazi Heel, and Walking Out of War. The Eastern Front Trilogy is the story of the largest and deadliest side of the Second World War, seen through the eyes of a man who was there from the earliest days in 1941 through Germany's grinding occupation of Ukraine, and finally to the savage end of the war in Berlin. You can find 3 individual volumes as ebooks exclusively on Amazon, or purchase the 3-volume complete paperback on any online book retailer or at your local bookstore. To learn more about the Eastern Front Trilogy, visit scottburyauthor.com.
As Scott elegantly describes in each episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was truly gargantuan, both in terms of its geography and its destructiveness. But given that there is so much territory to cover, and that so many millions of men were involved in the fighting, it's perhaps inevitable that some battles from the Eastern Front get overlooked. I'm David Sumner, and I'm the host of Europe at War, a weekly podcast exploring lesser-known battles and stories of the Second World War with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. From the drama of thousands of trapped German soldiers and terrified civilians attempting to break out of the Halbe pocket, to the unexpected and blistering counterattack launched by German forces on the Red Army during the Battle of Bautzen, many of the Eastern Front's most dramatic battles, particularly those which happened towards the end of the war, have long been neglected by historians, and their stories have remained untold until now. So to hear these incredible tales from the Eastern Front and more, check out Europe at War, available on all podcast platforms. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show.
Welcome to part 2 of the season 3 closer of Beyond Barbarossa. I'm Scott Bury, and my guest is Angus Wallace of the World War II podcast. Before the break, we were talking about what the Allies sent to the USSR at the outset of the Lend-Lease program. Angus, you mentioned the delay between the supplies' arrival and their use on the battlefield. The time factor is important in considering any supply line of any kind, but how long does it take to, you've made the decision, and sometimes political decisions take a long time to make. And then, okay, put in the orders, produce whatever you have, take it out of stock. And then the shipping routes were incredibly long all around the world, right? From both the east and west coasts of the United States, and then across the oceans, and then over the continent.
Well, do you want to explain the Tehran? I've forgotten the name of it. Because that's probably the key route, isn't it? The one through Iran.
The one that brought in the most was the overland across all of Asia. But yes, the Persian corridor, it was the longest route, not in terms of overland. So it came in through ports in Iran and in Iraq, including Basra. So it would arrive at those ports, then shipped by rail through Iran up to the Caspian Sea, back onto boats, across the Caspian and up the Volga River. And that's partly why Stalingrad was so important for the USSR. It was a major port on the Volga River between the Caspian and the industrial heartland of Russia and Moscow. But just to get to Iran, to those ports in the Indian Ocean or on the Arabian Sea, the boats would have to sail from the east coast of the United States around Africa, so around the Cape of Good Hope, up the Indian Ocean, because the Mediterranean, especially at the beginning, 1942-43, until what point in 1943 where
well, mid to late
Germans,
43, I would say we'd be starting to feel much more confident in the Mediterranean.
yeah, because it was controlled by the Axis. The ships were able to go through the Straits of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal, so it's shortened the trip a fair bit. On the other hand, this was the only all-weather route,
yeah,
right? All-season route, right? It was,
but it was also the only route that could take all-weather and heavy kit, because the other route is it Vladivostok it coming in through, and they're not allowed to take in armaments.
Right. So yeah, ships would leave U.S. West Coast ports and then cross the Pacific, and then they would have to sail pretty close to Japan, actually. So that's why they had to be Soviet flagged ships, even though they were probably built in the United States. Yeah. They had to be Soviet flagged, Soviet crews, and even so, they didn't always make it. But yeah, land in Vladivostok and then shipped by rail on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is one track all the way across Asia. So that's the longest route. So that was, had to be non-lethal aids. So that's where a lot of food came through.
And that was an agreement with the Japanese that the Japanese wouldn't close that port to Soviet ships.
Right.
So the Russians were bringing in foodstuffs primarily along that very, very long route. But these are only starting to come together. I tried to find the date when the railway line was sort of put in to really ramps up kit being brought in through that Persian corridor, and I failed miserably to find the date when it was completed. I know it's in the book next to you, but I couldn't find it. Right. But that's why, by not losing in 41, and as you pointed out, the Russians successfully remove factories. I mean, they did lose a tremendous amount of factories, but they did remove their industry. It's sort of from mid 42 that Russian manufacturing starts to get back on track.
Yes.
So that crucial moment, that crunch moment in sort of 41, where the Germans are all the way to Moscow, Lend-Lease really didn't win the war for Russia. The Russians managed to not lose on their own.
They managed to not lose. That's true. But I will point out there were real differences. It was a very desperate thing. So here's the next plug. As I describe in my book, The Eastern Front Trilogy, it's about my father-in-law who served in the Red Army. In 1941, they were desperately short of everything, ammunition, fuel, of course, but food was pretty scarce. The first volume of the trilogy is called Army of Worn Souls, because the Soviets marched so long with such poor supplies, their boots wore out. And they would have to wrap their feet in newspapers that they would stuff into the, whatever scraps of boot were left around their feet. And the food was, he described, there would be a mess tent or whatever, or usually a wagon, and it was watery soup with fish heads floating in it. But toward the end of the war, they had all this Western, basically U.S. supplied food. And I remember he told me all the boys really loved the American canned ham. They found it very tasty. Spam. Everybody loves spam.
And the Americans ship millions and millions of tons of food, enough to feed 6 million Russians. And importantly, it's high calorific food. Right. Because a lot of it's dehydrated, so they can ship very efficiently high amounts of calories, and that's what it's really all about is just calories. I just made a note to myself: an army can fight with no food, but it can't fight with no bullets. And this is perhaps where, in Russia in 1942, this is where Lend-Lease starts to work in Russia's favour, because whilst Russia is getting its industry back working, it's very much on a war footing. So it's starting to build tanks, it's starting to build planes. But what it's not doing, it's struggling to produce food. It's struggling to produce clothing. It's struggling to produce boots. And this is where the Russian economy, Russia hadn't worked out how to balance its economy, partly because of loss of lands where certain territories produce those foodstuff. But this is a problem that Britain had in the First World War when it goes to war, refuses initially in 1914. The government doesn't intervene in industry, expecting industry to just make up for whatever is needed. And then we get the shell crisis in 1915. And then they introduced conscription in 1916 as a way of balancing the economy. Conscription allows the government to take some men for the army, but not all. So it realizes that industry needs feeding, and then the government carefully manages industry to make sure that the boot and shoe industry in Northamptonshire is maintained, because the army needs millions of boots a year.
Right.
But at the same time, it ensures farmers remain on the field, and it just doesn't take all the farmers. Russia doesn't quite manage to, or doesn't have that conversation with itself on what do we need. It just goes to a war footing. It produces tanks, it produces planes, and what it does less of is produce trucks, uniforms, and food. And This is where Lend-Lease really comes into its own.
Looking at some statistics here. In 1941, take a look at the famous T-34s, the tank, supposedly the best tank of the war. Different perspectives on that, or maybe the most.
That's a whole rabbit hole not to go down.
Yeah, the most effective tank. But anyway, so in 1941, they only produced three. Of course, that was the beginning, the introduction of the T-34. They produced 3,016 tanks. In 1942, they produced 12,000 tanks, the T-34. In 43, 15,000. And then by 1944, they have a few different variants of the T-34 medium tanks. And so the production looks like about 14,000 of those. In 1945, they're producing 15,000 tanks a year. In total, they produced close to 60,000 tanks of the T-34, the medium tank series. So they did manage to get all those factories going. And there's the famous stories of how the tanks would roll right off the assembly line into the front lines of battle outside Stalingrad or Leningrad.
Yeah. And if you want to, here's some more statistics for you. Volume of munitions produced by year in billions of dollars. So the USSR in 1941 produced $8.5 billion of munitions. Britain produced 6. So Russia in 1941 was already outproducing Britain. And the United States, $4.5 billion of munitions. Though you take that to 1944 and the US produces $42 billion, and the USSR has doubled its 1941 to 16 billion, which shows you how much the US ramped up production. But that is some demonstration on how Russia still had an industry producing munitions in 1941, though it would be a mixed bag, as those factories had to have moved, and then they have to get the logistics back in to move the stuff that they've produced to where it needs to be. And Russia's big. It's not like you're moving it to a little front and it's got to go everywhere. And the Germans were seemingly pushing everywhere in certainly 1942. They're starting to go off and do different things.
Yes, they were doing the whole broad front strategy, attack everywhere all at once, and the enemy is going to break somewhere. But then that means you have to move people around, people, weapons, weapon systems, everything around, and they required rail for that. So you had some interesting statistics on rail production and locomotives.
Oh, yes. So according to the US State Department, a report they produced, I think, in 1945, so America shipped 6,000 tanks under Lend-Lease to the USSR, but they shipped nearly 2,000 locomotives to the USSR, which says a lot for what they're moving. Okay, what does Russia need? Well, we know they're producing T-34s. Let's ship them trains to move those T-34s to where they're needed. And this will come on to, what we'll ultimately be looking at is looking at trucks. Let's ship them trucks. I think it's important to note that this isn't we'll just ship you stuff. Russia tells America and Britain and Canada what it wants, and they try and fulfill those orders. It's an ordering system, and they do explicitly say, actually, we don't want those. We don't like them. They don't fit with whatever we're doing.
Right.
We don't want them. So this is a sort of a it's like Lend-Lease Amazon. Can we have that, and they will attempt to fulfill it. Yeah.
But the locomotives, rather, it was critical because the Red Army moved on rail.
Yep.
And the rail network was critical, which actually kind of limits things because you've got to go where the tracks are. So that was important. And little examples like in 1943, they built an extra rail line to supply Leningrad.
Yep.
And then, of course, once you start pushing the enemy, the invader, out of your country, beyond the reach of your rail system, and this is another little quirk, is that the Russian rail system, or the Soviet rail system inherited from Imperial Russian, was a different gauge than the Europeans had. It was wider. I remember my father-in-law told me some dirty joke about the difference in size. I can't really remember what the joke was, but anyway. So that's when trucks became so much more important. What was the volume of trucks that was supplied by the States?
363,080 trucks, 43,728 jeeps, and 32,200 motorcycles. What's interesting about the trucks is they ship over 350,000 trucks, but they only ship 2,000 spare truck engines.
Oh, that is interesting.
It's not many. So either those trucks are very reliable or they just chuck them away.
Possibly. I remember speaking a couple of years ago with David Stahl, and there's another episode for you to look back on, talked about, the engines were really important. Guderian was pushing for producing 2 engines per tank because tanks running on the steppe there was so much dust. The dust would get into the engines and totally destroy the engines. And he found an interesting statistic on the amount of engine lubrication oil that the Panzers needed, and wondered why it was. Found out this because there was so much dust clogging the tank engines. The only thing that they could do was flush them out with more motor oil.
Yeah.
But those numbers of production of tanks are really staggering numbers. And
that's throughout the war. So they're obviously not all there in 1940, whatever it is.
There are pictures, and I'll try to find one and put it on the webpage, of these ranks of Studebaker trucks waiting somewhere in Russia for deployment to the front.
Yeah.
But I'd like to go back a bit to what you mentioned, that Russia just doesn't have to lose the war. And that's, I think, critical in 1941-42. The Germans are able to advance so far. Russia, as you said, is so big that they're pulling back thousands of kilometers to within sight of Moscow, into Stalingrad. And when you look at a map, and especially telling, if you look at this on a globe, how far that is into the Caucasus Mountains. So they've got all the way around the Black Sea. These are incredible distances. It's been mentioned many times, many books and podcasts and films, just how great that distance is. And maybe that's why ultimately Germany could not win in the USSR, especially when you think about the winter of 1941, when the Germans got so close to Moscow. And it was just the sheer stubbornness of the Russian people fighting against that invasion that held them off. It was really something that they could not make that final step.
And I guess in retrospect, though, if you think the Germans have stretched themselves logistically to get all the way there. But at the same time, from a logistic point of view, roads have disappeared. Roads might not have even been there to start with. Famous, you get the Rasputin and everything turns to mud. Russians rip up railways as they're withdrawing. When the Russians have to advance over all that, they have kind of the same problem of getting an increasingly long logistic tail. The Germans are famously not that mechanized. They have a tremendous amount of horses pulling them. Actually, by the end of the war, the Russians have an enormous amount of motor vehicles that they can do these logistics. They build 30 to 40,000 kilometers of rail track in 1943-44, which is staggering. But that's to move, stuff from their manufacturing and from the Lend-Lease ports and their supply hubs forward, and then they can get these Lend-Lease trucks to take supplies from the railheads to where they're needed to feed what will be enormous Soviet armies. The Soviet army is fantastically big, and you couldn't have an army of that size unless you have a logistic backbone to be able to feed it. And if you're only producing tanks, you don't have that logistic backbone to be able to not just feed it in food, but feed it in ammunition. Because, a million men can fire a lot of bullets very fast.
Yes, that's true. Maybe it's a point where you can look at that counterfactual. What if the USSR had not had this Lend-Lease program, this amount of millions of tons, billions of dollars worth of equipment and food and everything else coming in to help them fight the Germans?
Before we get into that, I think we need another short break. Back in a sec, listeners.
Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel. And all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and tradition. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Angus Wallace of the World War II podcast is here to talk about the nuances of the Lend-Lease program, under which the Western Allies, chiefly the US, sent millions of tons of supplies to the USSR during the war. Before the break, I mentioned the idea of the counterfactual. What if the Lend-Lease program had never happened? What would have happened on the Eastern Front if the West hadn't sent all that equipment, those trucks, those locomotives, machine parts, clothing, food, and more? What if they hadn't sent the Hurricanes and the other planes and the tanks? Of course, it's impossible to prove a counterfactual to something that didn't happen, but let's play what if. Angus, what do you think? What if?
I suspect the Russians would have carried on not losing. They would have stood at Stalingrad. They would have not lost at Stalingrad. The distance was against the distance, and the attrition that the Russians pushed upon the Germans was so tremendous. Added to that, the Germans are also fighting the British and then the Allies. So they're continually having to look in all directions to the Germans. So without that influx of logistic support, the question is possibly would the Russians being able to mount those large offensives, those huge offensives, that they eventually push the Germans back in kind of huge. Russian offensives are enormous and then they stop. And then they're enormous and then they stop. They possibly couldn't do the build-up for those. They couldn't sustain them for as long. But undoubtedly, the war would have been won by the allied coalition. I guess the question would be, would Russia have got to Berlin?
Right. That is a really good question, because beyond Barbarossa hasn't got to that point yet, but the Allies had agreed that it would be the Red Army that would take Berlin first.
But when do they? Is that Yalta or Tehran? But the Russian are already by that point have already made great strides.
Right, that's right.
If they're not making those great strides, they can't come to those decisions.
Exactly. Those great strides, as you just said, were dependent on the amount of material that they're getting. They make that huge, one operation takes them from the Donetsk basin to the Dnieper River, which is a huge distance. Yep. The next major step, Stalin's 10 crushing blows, right, takes them all the way to it's 2 crushing blows, I guess, but that takes the rest of Ukraine away from Germany. So they've reconquered all of Ukraine by early 1944. So, but yeah, how much of that was enabled? A lot, yeah. They're using T-34s, they're using the heavy KV tanks, the Joseph Stalin tanks. Their factories are going full steam, but how much food do they actually produce?
1945, the Russians produced 30 to 40,000 tanks. The Germans produced 17,000 tanks. They're just outproducing the Germans. They produced 1945. They're producing 3,500 planes a month. Lend-Lease is only providing 500 planes. But you can have all the kit in the world, but if you cannot move the food, the fuel, the ammunition, you can only move as fast as men walking.
That's it.
Really, because the tanks need the infantry support. So you're completely hampered by the speed of which you can advance.
Right. And so and you look at the distances in the Soviet Union, it requires mechanized movement in some way.
You fall back on the problems that Napoleon had. You have to, how do you get your food forward when you haven't got that level of mechanization? It's impossible. And that level of mechanization is supplied through the Lend-Lease program that facilitates these Russian advances. So without the Lend-Lease material, yes, the Soviets would have held out. Yes, they would have helped turn the tide. But I suspect it's doubtful that they would have made the advances that they would have made.
Right.
And Stalingrad.
It just came to me. I thought, well, what difference would it have made if the Western Allies had all those supplies themselves? Maybe they would have had more planes than pilots, more tanks than crews. But
the Americans essentially did that to themselves, didn't they? They let Ernest King produce so many ships. In the end, they had to tell him they had to stop building ships because they could no longer provide sailors to sail any ships. So I suspect that we might have found that we just had too much of everything. We just couldn't have the manpower to operate it. And I'm not sure we really. I mean, you can nuance every argument, but the Allies in Northwest Europe had a lot of stuff. Now, they probably didn't always have what they needed at that moment, but that was probably more down to planning than production, unless something new had come online and they just hadn't got that production line going.
Right.
If that makes sense.
But when you look at the closing weeks or months of the war, in 1945, the Americans were quite capable of getting to Berlin. But they decided, Eisenhower said, no, we'll let the Russians do that. Now, probably had a lot of reasons, like why lose more American or Western lives in this fight. But they were quite close to Berlin by the time the Soviets were closing on it. So just those decisions made in Tehran and at Yalta were critical in getting the Red Army from Warsaw to Berlin. And so, again, the counterfactual, what if the decision had been different in Tehran? What if Roosevelt had listened more to Churchill than to Stalin? What if in Yalta the other decisions were made about the division of Europe following the war? And that brings me up to post-war, the Cold War. If the Soviets hadn't gotten to Berlin first, would the next 50 years have been completely different?
Well, there's another potential argument there that towards the end of the war, the Americans start getting suspicious that it becomes not just a movement of material, but a movement of technology, because the Russians are asking for goods that they can't produce and they don't know how to produce. And the Americans get slightly suspicious that the Russians are just starting to ask for things because they want to know how to build them themselves. So they're already shipping a tremendous amount of radio sets. The Russians don't build radio sets in great enough quantities. But when they start asking for the radar and other such weaponry, the Americans start getting a bit cold feet on shipping certain things and start holding back on technology, because towards the end of the war they're wondering if Stalin has got other things in mind, because there's some sensitive equipment which prior to 1945 they had no problem. We're winning the war, with eyes are on the prize. But towards the end of the war, as we start to look at a pre-war world, you've already got Patton talking about how the next war will be with the Russians. If we didn't ship any of that equipment to the USSR, those Studebaker trucks famously look like a lot of Soviet era trucks because they just copy the design.
Right. Yes. And also, when you talk about the Soviets wanting technology, they wanted the atomic bomb too. And so by the spring and summer of 1945, they're already spying, trying to get the Manhattan Project secrets. It was only a month after the end of the war in Japan that Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko came to the Canadians with evidence of Soviet spy networks in the West.
Yeah. Stalin had a much clearer idea of how he envisaged a post-war world, certainly than Roosevelt did, but that's possibly a whole other topic.
Yes.
He knew where he was heading. He knew what his victory looked like.
Yes.
I get actually another point for you. If the Russians hadn't managed to push so far west towards the end of the war, what that would have meant would be the Allies having to storm Berlin, and the vast amount of potential lives lost. Although one might argue that at that point the Germans might not have fought so hard because the Allies weren't Russians. They had to be less fearful. So perhaps the Allied victory, from the German perspective, they might have capitulated, and you saw much more of a First World War style surrender where the fighting stopped rather than be bludgeoned right to the end just because the Germans didn't want to be caught by the Russians.
Right. Well, the famous examples of Germans withdrawing eastward, running away from the Soviets in favor of surrendering to the Americans.
Yeah.
The whole breakout from the Halbe pocket, the whole idea was, let's get away from the Soviets, let's get over to the West and into the hands of the Americans. And then that whole mess became very politically driven rather than militarily.
Yeah.
And so, what if it was an American flag on the Reichstag?
Yes.
Or would they even have had to storm the Reichstag? Probably would have. It was SS troops in there.
Well, that's the if factor. How much would have anybody held out? But certainly, the question would be, how far would they have even got to Poland for the Warsaw Uprising? It's Lend-Lease trucks that project the Russian military that far west in those huge numbers, and could provide logistical support for those tremendous armies, feeding them with everything that they need. So without those trucks, this is where Lend-Lease is key. It's not key to Russia's survival in 1941.
No.
It's not necessarily war winning in 1942, but it transports the Russian army in 1944-45 in those enormous offences. And that's where it is decisive, those Russian campaigns. That's where Lend-Lease really comes into its own. But it's not in tanks, it's not in necessarily in airplane. Though they are there you can't sniff, there are significant numbers, but they're not significant compared at that point to what the Russians are producing. Right. In vast numbers, because their economy is solely focused on tanks and planes and war goods. And yes, they do food and other things, but not in enough quantity. Lend-Lease is filling in those gaps.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've reached our conclusion. It was critical in the movement, if not in the weapons, but
it's good. And it's a really interesting nuance. It's a very interesting nuance to think about Lend-Lease in that. And it's also worth, as I say, people think about the perspective of how they viewed Lend-Lease. Because it hadn't, until we started talking about it, whose perspective on Lend-Lease have we been viewing it by? Especially when you get to the numbers. I'm reading quoting the numbers from 1945. The Russians undoubtedly would dispute those numbers because the numbers the Americans sent weren't always the numbers that got there.
Right. Yes, there's that question too. Shrinkage, I guess, is what the commercial side would call it.
Yeah, as you point out, it's a long trip and there was lots of hazards on the way potentially.
I'm glad, Angus, that you suggested this topic because it's given us a lot of material and we've been talking quite a while. So thanks for the opportunity to appear on the World War II podcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's good fun.
Thanks very much, Angus, for a fascinating discussion. What about you, listeners? What do you think about the Lend-Lease program? What about the counterfactual? What if the West had not sent the aid? What if they had kept it all for themselves? And what if the Americans, and not the Red Army, had been the first to arrive in Berlin in April 1945? Let us know your thoughts. Send an email to scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or respond through the website beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. You can also respond through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. I'm also easy to find on other social media, Scott the Writer on Blue Sky, Scott Berry Author on Instagram, and so on. Take a look at the webpage for this episode for some charts and photos. You can find it at beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com or beyondbarbarossa.ca. And then all you have to do is click on the title, the text for the episode, not the picture, if you want to get to the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode, the Season 3 finale of Beyond Barbarossa. Still the first English language podcast that tells the story of the whole Eastern Front of the Second World War. Don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. And if you have a minute, please leave a rating or a review on your favorite podcasting app. That helps others who don't know about Beyond Barbarossa to find the podcast. Spread the word. You can help support the show, the research, and the recording efforts through Patreon. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you like. Patreon supporters get early and ad-free episodes, plus occasional bonus episodes. I want to thank all the supporters and members through podcasting platforms and Patreon. In chronological order, starting with the Patreon supporters, thank you very much to Stafford, Sean, Bruce, Sidney Tobias, Claude Jansen, Ed Morley, Bill Hall, Tom Gaffney, Craig Duncan, PFE, Elliot Goldman, Gavin Edwards, William L. Hall, and Nicholas A. Thomas. And to the members, Miles Morgan, Steph Sumner, Stephen Hunt, Daniel Sajdi, Thane Brown, Just van der Enden, Yihad A.R., David Burns, Kevin Milan, Frog, Oz, Zoran Todashlevich, Kevin, DMH, Dirk Jan Muntendam, Frankie the Footback, Abilio Barbosa, Kenny Duthie, Dave, Alanis Lino, Sergeant Miniman, Paul Burton Jr., Stephen Bull, Henriette Mellon, Christian John Polin, Adam Mansuri, Oren Truitt, Ashish Galinsky, Kevin M., Matt Mason, Dusty, Big Al, Witless Prohl, Damien Beeman, Vile Anola, Warren Allen, Nathan Wymore, Andre, Marquis 3, Robert Hooper, Gibsonian, Gilles Doucette, J.D. Sheepa, Mason Duke, Magnus, Jim Peck, Old Pete, Julie Ailbrecht, James Christian, Benjamin, Jobby, Javier Bruin, Ragui Marais, Jim C.E., Tauntaun, David May, Callaway, Arnold, and Lima, Ohio Man. My apologies if I have pronounced any of your names incorrectly. Correct me, send me an email. As I mentioned at the top, this is the finale episode of Season 3 of this podcast. I'm going to take a few weeks off to recoup and prepare more episodes. We'll return in August with new episodes, bonuses, and more. So thank you once again, and we'll see you in August. Remember, everyone, Canada is a free, independent, sovereign country. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Till next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina et vive le Canada.